Hello and welcome back to On the Continent. I'm just enjoying my Monday after what was a brilliant Sunday of Serie A action. Roma getting a late equaliser against Napoli to stop Antonio Conte and company pulling away at the top, which they had the opportunity to do because Milan kept Inter at bay, mostly kept Inter at bay in the Derby della Madonnina in the earlier game, late afternoon. And it was a terrific game. Obviously, it's always a great occasion, like the Milan derby, but this was a little bit extra. And I guess there are a couple of reasons for that. Part of that being the fact that Milan came into the game on the back foot a little bit, having lost at Dinamo Zagreb in the Champions League in the week, which finished their chances of finishing in the top eight, and got everyone on the backs of Sérgio Conceição, got Sérgio Conceição on the backs of the players, because as we've already discussed on the podcast, he's quite an explosive character at the best of times. Speculation that he might already been rubbing some of his big players up the wrong way, and maybe that the club would action an option to get rid of him at the end of the season. In fact, this was something that was put to him by the media after this derby draw with Inter on Sunday, and he said, "Well, look, I've still got my bags in the car." You don't really expect Sergio Conceição to make a joke in any situation, really, but at least he's still got his sense of humour, I suppose. What he has quickly discovered, Sérgio Conceição, is that the problems that dogged his compatriot Paulo Fonseca and led to him only lasting half a season. Of course, he's now in charge of Lyon from this weekend. Have not gone away, and just banging your fist on the table does not make them go away. You know, he had a great start, obviously, by winning the Supercoppa in Saudi, but it never really got to the root of what Milan's actual problems were. The fact that they could, much like they did in this derby, show up in the really big games. And it's the other games where they've lost points and lost faith in the project that they're trying to roll out. Now, of course, I guess when we're looking at them in a Champions League context, you always think of Milan being one of the most historic clubs in the European Cup / Champions League. So you expect something from them, and we expect something from them that's not really possible, not really available. If you go back to 2022, 23, when they got to the semi-final, them losing to Inter in that semi-final and not being particularly good in either leg was really the beginning of the end for Stefano Pioli, the predecessor to Paulo Fonseca. And Pioli had done an incredible job on a limited budget, on bringing a younger team through, in doing quite sensible recruitment above him, although the management structure above him has changed a little bit now. But it was the fact that they lost to Inter that really hung like a shadow over him. And really, a team of their means, the lack of recent experience in the Champions League at the time, should have been a great achievement for them to get to the semi-finals of the Champions League, but it was never really looked at like that. And I felt that was a little bit harsh on Pioli, even if that is the reality of Milanese football politics. But since then, as we said, it's especially this season, playing the big teams and taking on the big teams, which Inter are, you know, they're the best team in Italy, even if Napoli still lead the league as stands. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later on, and a little bit on the podcast on Thursday. It's everything else that has caused them the problems. Now, if you go back to what the problems were for Fonseca right at the beginning, getting 1 point from the first two games, you know, they were 2-0 down in the 90th minute on the opening day against Torino, came back to get a 2-2 draw, then lost away at Parma. They can't be dropping those sort of points, particularly early on. So 2 games into the season, there was massive pressure on Fonseca already, pressure that never really lifted, even though he beat Inter in his first derby, which was the best performance really of the first half of Milan's season, certainly outside the win at Real Madrid in the Champions League, and something which should have really enabled him to ring fence his position and reinforce what he had, and it never did. Partly because of his relationship with Theo Hernandez and Rafael Leao, the two stars in the team. And I guess this is something that Conceicao is finding difficult as well. Now, it was a heck of a week leading into the derby for Milan. Of course, in the previous home game against Parma, they'd, again, a little bit like Fonseca actually, come back from being 2-1 down in the 90th minute against Parma to win 3-2. And then Conceicao got into it with one of his players at the end, Davide Calabria. Fortunately, he was stopped from physically confronting Calabria by a clutch of players who understood what was happening pretty quickly. It could have been a lot worse. And Zlatan Ibrahimovic, of all people, stepping in as the peacemaker to diffuse that in the dressing room afterwards. But Calabria, who was running out of contract, is already out. He is being sold to Bologna. He left the training ground for the final time. He left Milanello in tears in his car this week. And I guess that can underline that you can't mess with Conceicao. Well, in the short term, that's the case. But in the medium term, I don't think it's something that makes Conceicao safe just because he's won that particular little battle. And it does underline the tension under which he operates. I think you saw the good and the bad of him in this derby against Inter, because Inter were in a position where we know they're the better team. They played pretty well, actually, I thought, and they had 3 goals disallowed. They hit the woodwork 3 times as well, before needing that Stefan de Vrij goal right at the end to save a point and deny Milan the win. I guess if they'd have seen it over the line as a 1-0 victory, Milan, and completed the Serie A double over the rivals for this season, people would have said, oh, it was a Conceicao tactical masterclass. It really shows that he knows what he's doing. I mean, there would have been a huge dose of luck in it, and there was a huge dose of luck in the fact that they got a point. But what we did see is Conceicao's Milan in this, which I think was really important. He talked, as he always does, about being aggressive, about being intense. And really, if we go back to Conceicao's long spell at Porto, where he really made his name in terms of being a manager, again, a club that's a traditional giant of the European game, but one that is lacking in modern day resource, not just compared to others, but compared to their own past as well. And he always wanted to play quite physical football, attacking football, but quite physical football as well. And I think we're seeing the start of that at Milan as well. I think the fact that they were really energetic, pressing high, making it difficult for Inter, even though Inter are the superior team, were things that, if they had have got that win, that would have been part of it. You know, the main part of it, really, their doggedness. Rather than defending perfectly, defending with genuine commitment and defending from the front. And Tammy Abraham was a huge part of that. He put in such an incredible shift. One of 3 English players starting the game, of course, Kyle Walker making his debut. Even if he lost Nikola Zawewski for the equaliser, which Zawewski set up with a brilliant chested pass for De Vrij. I thought Walker had a really good game. You can see the physical engagement he's going to have. The fact that he will really fit into what Conceicao is trying to do. And of course, probably the most important of the 3 Englishmen in this context, Fikayo Tomori, who played at centre-back. Now, earlier in the window, Milan wanted to sell him to Juventus. Conceicao absolutely did his nut about that. He was really furious. He dug his heels in and said, we can't let him go to a domestic rival. So that didn't happen. And Juventus continued their hunt for a centre-back. Then he had the option, Tomori, of going to Tottenham. And he refused in the last couple of days, ended up starting this derby. And again, a really dogged performance, leaning into the best of his spell at Milan, where he's been globally good, but he has had a few down bits and he's been left out of the team quite a lot this season. But I thought what was the most interesting thing outside that is the fact that he made that change at half time, Conceicao. The fact that Ismail Benacer, who's such a good dictator of the tempo of the game in midfield, was taken off, and he stuck on Alex Jimenez, who came over from Real Madrid and has done a really good job in recent weeks. Because, as Conceicao put it, Jimenez is about that power, about taking the game to the opposition, that little bit more physical side of the game, whereas Benacer needs to be protected, needs time on the ball, and I guess in terms of what Benacer is going to do for Milan going forward, he's not really a Conceicao type of player. It was one of the biggest criticisms of him when he was at Porto, even though he was very successful. Porto fans who are used to seeing dazzling teams, of course, you look at some of the players they had in the past, like Paulo Futre, Ulk, James Rodriguez, Moutinho, all of those and more, not to mention the Champions League winning side under Mourinho. They've had some great flair players over the years, and Conceicao, it was felt, leaned more into players who were athletes and physical. Now, will he do that for Milan? And will he get to a point where that creates a disconnect with the fans? I think that's got to be the question, because Milan are still mid-makeover. Now, of course, we're recording this on Monday morning, so we're not at the point yet where we've reached the transfer deadline. There are a few more transfers to happen. I've already got rid of Alvaro Morata, who's gone to Galatasaray, a very versatile forward who I feel would have worked well for them, but they wanted to bring in a younger man and a stone-cold finisher in Santi Jimenez, who's joining from Feyenoord. Of course, scored those 2 goals against Bayern in the Champions League recently, scored against Manchester City at the Etihad on his comeback. A really terrific poacher, very different type of striker to Morata, and one on slightly less wages as well, even though they're bringing him in for a big fee, because Morata was a relatively big earner in that squad. So how Milan look next weekend, I think, will be really interesting, because this was not the perfect game, but in some ways the perfect Conceicao game, this Milan derby, because it was a big occasion where he could show his passion, where he could get his team to show their passion and get stuck in. And he said after the game about Rafael Leao, his compatriot, who he hopes to get the very best out of, he still needs to apply himself more off the ball. We still need a little bit more out of him. And, you know, he can be brutal with players and really try and get them to feed into that collective. It'll be interesting to see whether Leao can really do that on a consistent basis, which has been an issue for him, even though he's so incredibly talented, of course. So it'll be interesting to see not just the personnel, but whether they can really take on what Conceicao wants to do, and whether that will be enough for them to make the top 4. We know they can show great commitment and really exhilarate us with a performance in the derby, even if it didn't quite result in a win in the end. But can they do it week on week? And can they do it in the playoff against Feyenoord, of course, because, of course, they've got that big Champions League playoff. And that, I think, and the result of that, and whether they can get in the last 16, the Champions League and beyond, as we said, it's a huge part of Milan's personality as a club. So whether Conceicao can get them there, he got Porto into some quite deep runs in the Champions League, despite their limited resources. That could also play into his future, although I do suspect his personality will decide some of it. Thanks so much for joining us on OTC YouTube. Remember, of course, to subscribe to the podcast in your favourite preferred podcast catcher. Every Thursday, me, Dot Nadabayo, and a series of guests with loads of different brilliant perspectives on the European game. And of course, every Friday, you can join us on the pod as well for Ask OTC, where we answer your questions. So if you leave them below the line here, or get in touch with us on the socials. We'll see you soon.